Alright gang, what is happening? Before we go any further, I want to snag your ear just for a moment to talk about Anchor. If you're thinking of starting a podcast of your very own, or perhaps you already have one, but you're looking for a new host, then I can't recommend Anchor highly enough, and that is for a number of reasons. Firstly, it is free. That's right. No monthly charges, no reoccurring fees or startup fees. Secondly, Anchor gives you a number of creative tools to record, edit, and arrange your podcast episodes, which is perfect if you don't even know where to start when making a podcast. You can record through your computer via their website browser, anchor.fm, or get this, straight through their free-to-download app. So whether you're looking to document the daily adventures of your labradoodle, create an original episodic drama based on all of that true crime you binged during lockdown, or you're wanting to create a show that investigates both the mysteries and the meaning of... No, wait, hang on a minute. That's my wheelhouse. Get out. Find your own lane. Whatever your ideas are, with the app, all you have to do is hit record on your phone and boom, you're creating podcast gold in a matter of seconds. Not only that, but Anchor will also distribute your show to the likes of Spotify and Apple Podcasts, ensuring you and your labradoodle crime drama lands in the earboxes of countless new listeners. It is everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
I have to tell you, I've done about 2 or 3 dozen interviews for this book. No one's ever asked me that. It's a great question.
Alright gang, what is happening? I am Mal Foster and you are listening to the 3rd episode of... No. It's not. It's definitely not the 3rd episode. You're listening to the latest episode of your 3rd favourite above average. I mean, even that now, let's be honest. Saying that we're above average at this point when I can't even get my own introduction right, that's maybe stretching things a little bit. But I digress, it's not even a minute in and I'm already doing it. But you are listening to the latest episode of your 3rd favourite above average, allegedly, podcast, Dimed Out. A show dedicated to exploring both the mysteries and the meanings of life. That's quite a big challenge to undertake when I can't even get the intro right. It's an audio kaleidoscope of experience, culture, and other stuff. And this week's other stuff is pretty serious. I'm going to kind of get myself back on track here. Yeah, what we're going to be talking about here is pretty serious, to say the least. It is a guest week. It's not just me, which I am sure you are kind of over the moon about. This week, I am joined by...
Amye Archer, and yes, if you're looking for me, there's an E on the end of Amy. There are many, many Amye Archers without that E, so I had to put the E on.
And to switch things up this week, and to also stop me waffling on any further, we're going to just jump straight into it. Amy's going to introduce who she is, a little bit about her background, and what she is here to talk about. So, yeah, in a refreshing change of pace, which I'm sure some of you will actually prefer, let's get into it. This is me talking to the wonderful Amye Archer, and I'll see you guys on the other side.
I'm a writer, I'm a teacher, I'm a mom, I do a little podcasting on the side, but my labor of love that I spent the last 3 or 4 years working on is a book called If I Don't Make It, I Love You, Survivors in the Aftermath of School Shootings. And it came out in 2019, right before the pandemic hit, right at the end of 2019. And it's full of about 83 stories, firsthand accounts from people who've lived through or survived school shootings. So that's kind of what I'm here to talk about today and what I've been living the last couple of years.
So, yeah, you say you've been living with this for the last few years. How did this even start? Like, what was the inception for the idea behind the book?
So, Mal, the idea came about on December 14th, 2012. The Sandy Hook shooting happened.
Right.
and I have twin daughters, and they turned 6 2 days before that.
Wow.
And it was transformational to many parents in this country. I wish it was more transformational to lawmakers, but it wasn't. But it changed me. Like I like to say that it kind of rearranged the parts inside of me as a mom. And I realized that I had to do something. So I became kind of a low-key advocate for some of these causes to draw attention to gun violence in schools. Right. I was raising, twin daughters, so I wasn't able to be on the front lines. But when my daughters were old enough, I knew that I wanted to do something like this, a book full of narratives of some kind. I have a co-editor on the book. Her name is Lauren Kleinman, and we were talking about what we could do. And I kind of said to her, like, we need to do something around Sandy Hook. We need to do something around school shootings. Now, I am 43 years old, so I consider myself part of the Columbine generation.
Right, yeah.
I was in college when the Columbine shooting happened in 1999. And so I feel like my life, my adult life, has been oddly kind of bookmarked by school shootings.
Right, yeah.
And so we started the book with the question of what happened to those kids in Columbine? How did they make it through? The ones who survived, like how did they get on? Right. So that's kind of the research question that we went into the book with.
So that was kind of like your entry point and your source of origin is kind of looking at it from that perspective, because that's really interesting. Yeah. Because, understandably, whenever Columbine comes up, a lot of emphasis, sadly, is put on the perpetrators that did it. They get a number of minutes of attention to that. But after that, it's the victims, understandably so. But a lot of people kind of gloss over the fact that there were countless other kids in that school that day. And how has that, as you say, affected them? And what kind of knock-on effect has that had? That's a really interesting sort of entry point. So you've got that in mind, and that's your, as we say, your genesis. Where do you go from there?
So how we got started was I was a member of Moms Demand Action. I don't know if you're familiar with that organization.
I'm not, no.
It was started by a self-described mother and housewife, Shannon Watts, who had a tremendous career in the business world and kind of knew marketing and knew what to do. And she was so affected by Sandy Hook that she started Moms Demand Action a day or two after from her kitchen on Facebook. And it grew to, it's one of the biggest advocacy groups for gun reform and survivor rights. So I was part of that group, and we have a Facebook group that's private for each state. And I remember just putting in there, a call like, hey, do you guys know anyone who might be, because there's a lot of people in that organization that work in survivor outreach, or they work in different aspects.
Yeah.
So I just was like, do we know anyone who might be willing to talk to me? Because I was also kind of afraid of, I'm so protective of these survivors because, there is a voyeuristic aspect to this.
Yeah.
In some ways. And we came across that when we were doing the book, like people who said they were in a school that they weren't.
Really?
So, yeah. So I was really concerned about how do I approach this with the ethos of, who I am, and knowing that my intentions are good and I'm not the press, and I'm not,
Right. You're not a grief hawk that's looking to pick away at what is clearly a very raw, still open wound.
Exactly. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's all right. Animals are always welcome here.
So I just, that's how it started. And they connected us with a few people. And one of the first people who I spoke to was a woman named Jamie Amo from Columbine, who has since become a very successful and fierce advocate for this group. And she was really brave. And, we talked for a long time, and she told me her story. And I just said, you need to write this. You need to write this story, because her story was about not really dealing with the trauma from the shooting, which many of those schools in the 90s did not. Right.
Right. Yeah.
So they just thought, let's get back to business. So she kind of, like many other survivors, it's a recurring theme in the Columbine chapter. She just pushed it down and went on with her life, but it pops up in different ways.
Yeah.
And when she became a mother, she was in her kids' kindergarten or first grade classroom, and they had a active shooter drill. And she describes the moment that she like froze, and she realized at that moment, my kid quite possibly could go through something like I did.
Mm-hmm.
And she was called to action in that moment. So I thought that was a great story.
Yeah.
Like how are these people who are called to action, these survivors, how does that happen? Like, when does it, now we see it like with Parkland, it happens immediately.
Right.
It's immediate, right?
Mm-hmm.
But with Columbine, it wasn't. A lot of these people did not become advocates and involved in the movement until they were adults.
I think a lot of people, and this is just me presuming as well, a lot of people don't realize how much of an effect it's had until a certain point later in life as well, especially around that era when it wasn't so prevalent, and it was more of a unique incident, and there wasn't as much aftercare. There wasn't as much counseling, there wasn't as much help, there wasn't as much activism based from it. It was, as you say, okay, let's just pick up and carry on, and we'll just push through and persevere.
Yeah. And there were quite a few shootings in the years preceding Columbine, directly preceding Columbine, that I had never even heard of,
Mm-hmm.
which I was stunned. I mean, there are so many shootings that we could not include.
Right.
And I knew that would happen, but there were also so many shootings that we had never heard of. And I was really surprised, especially because like I kind of had been living in this world a little bit,
right.
at least.
Yeah.
I'm politically active. I pay attention to the news. I consider myself well informed. And I had never heard of these shootings. And, these survivors received zero support. I mean, outside of what their families could do for them
Right.
and their friends,
Yeah.
but no real support like they really needed.
No. I want to talk to you just briefly about actually speaking to people for the first time, because you mentioned like not being a member of the press, not trying to sort of pick the bones of a juicy story for the sake of sort of an exploitative reason, but you're coming in with all good intentions and, coming in from the perspective of a mother as well. And as you say, the effects of Sandy Hook has kind of reconfigured a lot of your framework. How was that in terms of first approaching people to speak to? I can only imagine it was extremely daunting, and you were presumably quite apprehensive.
I have to tell you, I've done about 2 or 3 dozen interviews for this book.
Mm-hmm.
No one's ever asked me that.
Huh.
It's a great question because that was a huge hurdle to overcome. So it's a great question to ask. Thank you for raising it. It was really difficult, and it was something that I was a nervous wreck about. I actually practiced talking to them with some of my friends, my close friends, because I was so nervous. Because the last thing, like I went into this thinking, the last thing I want to do is cause these people an ounce of pain that they don't have already suffered.
Yeah.
So I was just so, cognizant of that and aware of what they had been through. The way that I approach them is kind of like heart first, like here's who I am. This is how Sandy Hook affected me. I'm a writer, I'm a mom, I'm a teacher, and I believe in the power of personal narratives. And for each survivor, I told them about my dream for this book. And my dream for the book was that my grandchildren will someday read this book with the historical distance and perspective that I, as a 6th grader, read The Diary of Anne Frank.
Right.
That was something that brought the Holocaust to our doorsteps as children because we were reading a firsthand narrative from another child. But it was something that you were like, oh my God, I can't believe that ever really happened. And that's how I wanted I want future generations to read this and say, I can't believe that happened, because it's not happening now.
Right. You want them to be in a period where there isn't that sense of relatability that sadly we have now.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. So I think once I started framing it that way, that I hope that people saw I was genuine and agreed with that vision of the book. And we all kind of worked from there.
Was it quite an open response from a lot of people, or did you find that was something that kind of came over time the more that you spoke to them? Or I suppose maybe it varied from person to person.
It varied from person to person. The way that Lauren, my co-editor, and I split the stories up is she worked on all the colleges and I worked on all the primary and secondary schools. So I did Sandy Hook, I did Columbine. And so of course I formed a tighter bond with those communities. Yeah. But I have been traveling a little bit and I've gone to various locations and survivors have come out to the readings when I've been doing them. And it's been amazing. And there are people that I didn't necessarily work with on my chapter, but of course I was well aware of their story because I edited the whole book with Lauren. So it was really neat. And I feel like this book just brings together people that you might not expect to come together. So that was really a cool.
Are you finding that there is bringing a sense of connectivity? Like people are feeling more comfortable maybe to the people that you obviously haven't spoken to, as you say, they're coming out to readings. That's an amazing thing. That's a powerful thing to see.
Yeah, it's really powerful. It's reaffirming my work here.
Yeah.
And when I say my work, I mean the work of putting this together. The survivors are the ones who did the work, right? Like they told the stories. Right. It was my job, I feel like, and Lauren's job to talk to them to figure out what that story was. And so, we were kind of the guiding force, but they were the ones who bravely just opened up on the page and put it out there. So that was really, really cool.
Yeah, and that is a lot to sort of open up to, There's a lot that I can, again, thankfully, having not been in that position, I can only, assume for better or worse, but there's must be an awful lot to unpack to yourself and then to share it with other people as well.
Yes. And one of the things we wanted to be cautious of was kind of every story sounding the same from each group, right? So, and we did run into some of that, but we were able to really talk to the survivors. And I'm specifically thinking about those schools I mentioned, Thurston, Heath High School, that happened right before Columbine, where the survivors that I was working with were all the student perspective and they were all the same age and kind of a similar perspective.
Yeah.
So we really worked to personalize the stories in that it's not just the story of the day of the shooting. It's the aftermath. It's what happened after: bad marriages, substance abuse, advocacy, all those different routes that people took. So it was really like a cultivation of these stories. And when we put the stories together, we put them in reverse chronology. So while we were working on the book, 2 shootings happened. We started a month after Parkland happened. And Great Mills High School happened in March of that year. And then Santa Fe High School happened in May of that year. So Santa Fe High School is the first chapter in the book.
Yeah.
And that was very raw. And what I wanted, it's funny because my therapist actually came up with this idea. I was telling her in a session the one day that when you lay the stories out from the closest shooting to the furthest, you could almost see the form that the trauma takes through a lifetime.
Huh. Yeah.
And she was like, that's a really good idea. You should order the book that way instead of because Austin, Texas is always the first. So that would have been the first. In our book, it's the last. So that's kind of how we did it. Yeah,
that is a really interesting way of putting it together because you do get like the full arc of, as you say, like the trauma. And I think the fact that you're covering it from different angles and you're looking at how it's affected not just parents, but students and family
teachers
members. And you're just seeing how many fractures and sort of breaks there are and just how widespread the effect actually is,
Yeah.
I think it's an amazing thing to show just how vast and unfortunately how vast the spectrum is from these things.
Absolutely. When we did Santa Fe, I worked with a mother, Rhonda Hart. Her daughter was killed, Kimberly.
Yeah, I was
And
going to bring this up. Yeah, this is fascinating how you've put this together.
yeah, so she could not write. She just couldn't. I mean, it had just happened. So I said to her, with your permission, can I go through your Instagram? Because she was very vocal on Instagram, or on Twitter. I'm sorry. She was very vocal on Twitter, and she was just kind of hurting out loud, right? Like hurting out loud. So I said to her, do you mind if I do sort of a graphic story for you? And I go through and I pull tweets that tell the story of Kimberly's death and your reaction to it. She said, no, that's fine. So I did it. And I spent a good solid 2 weeks just immersed in this woman's Twitter line, which she was tweeting a lot because she was hurting. And that was her outlet, you know?
Yeah.
And I built that Twitter story and I sent it to her and she just loved it. And that meant so much to me, you know, that I just built this story that I felt captured what had happened and that she was really happy with it. So
yeah, it's a really unique way of getting into a story without kind of prodding into something that is, as you say, so raw.
Yeah.
Because that is not somebody in that moment. That is not somebody who is willing already and understandably wanting to kind of talk about that because they're processing it. But you get to see the various stages of process through reading through the timeline, and you get to see such a myriad of emotions.
Yeah.
You know, disbelief, anger, joy as well, weirdly enough, at looking back at previous photos and little details that go along. And that seems to be something, because I've read the first 2 chapters of the book, and little details is something that I've wrote in my notes as being like a real emphasis and a real key to a lot of stories. It's not so much the big headline pieces of information, it's the little details, it's the tiny things. And with the case of Rhonda and her story kind of going through that, it's little details from, as I say, past memories, things about her daughter, Kimberly. And the thing that I've put here in my notes that's really struck me from the first 2 chapters, and the first chapter in particular, is the idea of knowing and not knowing. So there's a point in Rhonda's story through her timeline where she finds out specific details about how many times Kimberly was shot and where and how. And it's those specific details which just seem to break her. That seems to be the point where it just really, really sort of hits home.
Yeah.
And then the counterbalance to that, the not knowing aspect, is to kind of go to the intro of the book with Fred Guttenberg, where he says, and this got me really hard.
Yeah, I know.
Did I tell my kids I loved them as they ran out the door? Did I stop to tell Jamie I loved it? It's little things like that. It's the things, the ethereal parts that kind of just float away, that have no solid definition, which seem to be the most haunting.
I agree with you 100%. We worked with the gentleman who, I'm not going to give his name because he ended up not writing for us because his family just didn't feel that they wanted him to. A lot of these families, they're very hesitant because, you know, people come after them, which is a whole other thing I'll talk about. But he wrote about his daughter and her tracking her iPhone. And when the shooting occurred and then he tracked her iPhone, he realized that it was them taking her to the morgue. And that was like, because I can't tell you as a mother, my daughters are 14 now, how many times I'm using track my iPhone on them all the time.
Yeah.
To think of that.
I don't have kids, but just to think of somebody that I cared about.
Yeah.
To kind of put even, wow. And again, it's the little details like that which really flash out. I mean, unless it's like so many things, unless you've been in those shoes, unless you've experienced that, which hopefully, God forbid, anybody listening to this never has that identifiable sense of relatability. But unless you've been in that, you can't really truly know. But it's little details like that which bring you closer to that person.
And those little details, Mal, like, are the things that haunt me. You know what I mean? Like, you can't, I remember I worked with Sandy Hook, and I worked with Danielle Barden's family. Natalie Barden actually wrote for us the afterword, and she was, she was a young kid when her brother was killed. She shared with me, and her family shared with me, a lot of artifacts, because we also have, if you go to our website, ifidon'tmakeitiloveyou.com, there's a digital archive of artifacts that the survivors have shared with us.
Wow.
So she shared with me a letter that Daniel's kindergarten teacher, so he was in first grade when he was murdered, Daniel's kindergarten teacher had written to the parents about how sorry she was and what a beautiful child he was. To this day, like, I get choked up thinking about it. I remember that wrecked me for weeks. Like, I went into my therapist's office, I sat down, and I just started sobbing. Like, I couldn't even get my head around that. Like, it's those little things. You're right. Like the little, like, waiting for the red receipt on the text and never getting it. Like, those little things just, that's what, when I run into somebody who tells me a child has more of a chance of dying in an airplane than in a school shooting, that's the details I want to shove into their brain. You know,
Right.
those are the things I want to push into them and say, live with this for a while, because that's what they need to hear.
When you encounter that, it really does make you scratch your head and think, like, how can you have such a lack of just general empathy?
Yeah.
You know, when it's mind-boggling, and and having covered so much of this and having lived with this, I mean, I'm obviously preaching to the choir here, but it must just be a mix of just sheer disbelief and just anger and sadness as well, that somebody is of that ilk, that they just can't connect to this very basic human thing of, how can you say that in this regard?
I honestly believe I have always been pretty politically active. And I've always, when I was growing up in the 80s, I'm 43. So when I was growing up in the 80s, my dad worked for a defense contractor. And we were a Reagan household through and through. Like, it was Reagan, Reagan, Reagan. But I grew up and eventually became a Democrat. But I feel like I understood Republicans because I had been amongst them for a very long time. When I saw President Obama crying in the Rose Garden when they did not pass a simple background check bill from Manchin Toomey after Sandy Hook, that was the day, like, it sounds weird, but that was the day, like, my political heart broke. I was like, this country, it's just not what I thought it was. Like, I followed politics my whole life. I loved politics, and I loved, I'm such a nerd about, like, presidential history and stuff like that. Something broke that day. I was like, this is a broken country. And I'll never forget him coming on and he was crying tears of anger is what he was doing. And because the day Sandy Hook happened, I remember him crying during his press briefing. And that was comforting at the time. But this day, it was the Manchin Toomey bill, and it failed. And he was stunned. And I think, I could be wrong, but I think he wrote about that in his memoir, that was like the hardest day of his presidency. Either Sandy Hook the day or that day, one of them. Yeah. But I just remember thinking, like, I grew up in a country where if you could save the life of one kid, you did it. Like, that was it. We sacrificed because we cared about our children. Like, what is happening? That we would rather design a school with curved hallways so kids can't get hit by a school shooter.
Is that something
that's something that's happening?
That's an actual thing.
That's happening. Yeah.
Wow. So, and I suppose my perspective is kind of interesting because this is somewhat new to me. I've lived here for 2.5 years. Obviously, being attuned to what's happening in the world, even from the other side of the Atlantic, it was kind of evident that there was a real problem, and there's been a real problem for a long time. But it's not until actually living here and being here for over 2.5 years and seeing week after week after week after week after week mass shooting, and seeing that replay over and over and over again, that I've realized just how much of a problem it is.
Yeah. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in the north of England.
So I think, I was talking to somebody else about this, and I know it's anecdotal, but when I watch like a good BBC murder mystery, which
Right.
there are many, right? Watching a good,
Yeah.
like a, Broadchurch, right?
Yeah.
As an American, I am stunned by the lack of guns in those shows.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, wait a minute. Not everybody's pulling guns on each other.
No.
Nobody's like flipping out and shooting the place up. Like, what is happening? And it's then times like that you realize, like, and Shannon Watts on the cover of our book calls this a uniquely American phenomenon.
Yeah.
And it's times like that you realize it really is.
Yeah.
It really is.
It genuinely really is. And this is not to say that we don't have guns in England, because we do. Usually they are gathered from illegal means, to be honest.
Yep. And you have them in moderation and when appropriate.
We do, and for the most part, it's down to farmers who need specific licenses, and for hunting parties who need specific licenses. But we had one incident in the early to mid 90s. I can't remember the date exactly, or the year rather, called Dunblane, which happened, in which a sole shooter, an adult, walked into a school and killed children. Since then, it was a real firm lockdown.
Yeah.
On gun control. And
well, even Australia, look at the response there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, other countries respond appropriately to this.
What do you think?
We haven't.
What do you think is the reason why there hasn't been a response? I have ideas.
I mean, how foul would you like my language to get?
Hey, you can drop as many F-bombs as you want.
I don't know. I think we have in this country an entire network that just pumps out misinformation to the masses.
Yeah, that's become really evident over the last 12 to 18 months.
Yes. So I think a lot of this happened because we had the assault weapons ban and everything under Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of this happened under Obama. I think that you had an entire news network telling the American people that Obama was going to take your guns.
Right. And that seems to be the first line of defense in terms of hysteria for those that are going to respond to it.
Now, I will tell you, if I were a hunter, and my husband's a hunter, and he has hunting rifles in our house, appropriate hunting rifles. My in-laws, we live kind of in the middle of nowhere. They have a pistol and they have a shotgun, right? Everything's licensed, whatever. If they truly believed, even if Donald Trump said, I'm going to take every gun away from you in this country, I could see that being a problem. Yeah. I get it. That's not what was happening, but nobody was reporting what was happening.
No.
And I think, you can go back to when we passed the assault weapons ban, and Fox News was not Fox News. And that is the problem. That is the problem in this country, is we have created, and it got worse in the last 4 years, we've created this aura of misinformation that nobody knows who to trust and nobody knows what's right. And I mean, even though I'm a Democrat, sometimes I turn on, MSNBC, and I'm just like, guys, do we have to have the I hate Trump hour every single hour? They're kind of guilty of the bias too.
Oh, absolutely.
But at least it's not misinformation.
Right.
Like the blatant just misinformation that Obama was going to come and get your guns was just on repeat. And so I think there was a little hidden nugget of racism there, and a lot of misinformation.
Oh, for sure. It's definitely a very potent combination of both of those things. And the idea that, moderation doesn't sell. Moderation doesn't get viewers.
Correct.
Moderation doesn't buy ad revenue. What does is hysteria. What does is having an agenda and pushing that agenda to the people that for sure are going to buy it and come back each and every night, Hence why Tucker Carlson has a show.
Yeah, there you go. And let's not discount the power of the NRA either.
No, exactly. And they have had a big hand in this problem, this ongoing problem. And it's the financial backing. It's the investments that they've given to people that are going to protect their interests and who are more than happy to take X amount of cash for mutual support.
I think the NRA And I give Shannon Watson, Moms Demand Action, a lot of credit here. I think the NRA has been incredibly weakened.
Yes.
I think.
Yeah.
But they're still not gone.
No.
They're still not gone. And fear and paranoia is a lot, like, that's how they build their base.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of it out there.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's not in short supply.
No.
But yeah, it definitely has been weakened, and hopefully the further we move forward, the more that we get these stories out, the more that we have conversations, the more that people are willing to listen to conversations that normally wouldn't, I think is definitely something that can help sort of build a bridge and move things forward. It's finding a way to sort of break through the fortified barricade of these echo chambers that a lot of people find themselves in. Because a lot of these people that say these awful things like, oh, you're more statistically likely to die in a plane crash, if they actually were to open themselves up to these conversations, if they were willing to kind of put aside the feedback loop of what they've been told day after day after day, and actually sit with the details and look at it from a specific zoomed in perspective from real people, it may begin to take effect, or it may begin to push them towards thinking a little differently. And if you can push people to thinking a little differently about something that they've completely shut off, then you can engage in more discourse and conversation, and you can move things forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find that on the rare occasion that, I've sat down face to face and talked to somebody about something like this, they do see it in a different light. Mm-hmm. When you assure them, like, it's not about rewriting the Second Amendment.
Right.
It's not about that.
No.
It's about, are you a criminal? You shouldn't have a gun. Do you have, are you a domestic abuser? You shouldn't have a gun. Mm-hmm. Simple things like this. And who did this really well was the March for Our Lives kids, the Parkland kids.
Yeah.
They went around the country and they sat down. I specifically remember them spending a lot of time in Texas around the Beto campaign. And they were sitting down, like, they would send these pictures out of them sitting down with, people who open carry and love their guns, and they would sit down with them in a room. And by the time they left, like, they were
meeting somewhere. Right.
You know what I mean? And that's how we have to have conversations.
Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's finding a common ground. It's finding a place of specific interest. It's finding a latch to bring people closer towards a middle ground. It's just getting there. It's pretty difficult sometimes.
Yeah. And it's interesting because if you follow the last election that we had, and I followed it very closely, these debates that we have aren't really debates, are they?
No.
Like
No.
The moderator asks a question. No one else is allowed to say anything. Right. The person answers and then they move on. That's not a debate.
No.
And one thing I have to give Bernie Sanders credit for is he had real debates with people. Mm-hmm. Like, he got on a stage with Ted Cruz and had a debate, like a conversation.
Yeah.
And even though we were all like, oh, Ted Cruz, it was interesting to watch. And they were able to talk to each other.
And it's promoting the idea of having discourse from both sides of the aisle. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
From what we've been saying, in terms of moving forward towards some kind of reform, which we do desperately need. Look, there are going to be people that say, no, we don't. Of course, we've talked about some of those examples. And, they're entitled to their opinion, but in this case, it's very, very wrong. I don't mind saying that. But how do we get there? How do we get to a point of reform? How do we get to a point of change? Because it does seem increasingly difficult in some regards, because obviously at the minute you're seeing a big seismic shift in terms of the GOP, and you're seeing a lot of that hysteria that we said, and a lot of that misinformation is still very potent. And in the absence of he who shall not be named, it seems like there's more concentrated efforts to stoke culture wars and to kind of really twist the knife into certain points of political division. So on that front, it's difficult. And recently over here, we've had House Bill 1927, which is proposing people are allowed to open carry without a license, without training.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, it is absolutely unbelievable. And as somebody that doesn't come from this culture, I was already pretty kind of scared about things to begin with. That is just adding an extra layer of it on top. So in that regard, we are kind of moving away from the solution. But in terms of conversations, in terms of, especially regarding Parkland, a lot of young people saying this shit is done, we've had enough, no more of this. You're seeing more of that. You're seeing a lot more young people becoming politically active in general, but specifically when it comes to things like this. So on that hand, we're kind of moving closer to a solution.
Yeah, I think so. So a couple things there.
Okay.
Let's take this open carry thing.
Yeah.
That's all right. First, let's take this open carry thing to its logical conclusion, right? So anyone can open carry.
Mm-hmm.
So does that mean if I'm in a Target, no pun intended, and somebody comes in, can I just shoot them because I think they're a bad guy with a gun? Like, am I now able to murder people?
Right.
I don't know. I mean, it worked with Trayvon Martin, right? Worked with that case. You're just able to shoot somebody and say you felt threatened and you get away with it.
Yeah.
So is it going to turn into the Wild West in our retail stores and in our public spaces? Or is everybody just going to be armed? I don't know. And as a mother, that's terrifying to me. The second thing is two things. I think that the younger people are starting to vote. And they are coming out in droves.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a generational shift.
Yeah.
They are suffering. I hate to say because I really don't think this is on the Gen Xers. I think it's more on the boomers. But
it is.
They're suffering our collective adult universe.
Right.
Our mistakes and our inaction, right? They're suffering.
Yeah.
So they are going to come back. They're going to vote in droves. The third thing is, I think how this is solved is the way that Obamacare was solved. So everybody hated Obamacare. Nobody wanted the Affordable Care Act. People got it, and now they don't want it taken away because they realized, hey, this is a pretty good thing. So I think we need to vote in the right people who will change the laws. And once people see that the Second Amendment hasn't been stripped away, nobody's knocking on my door taking these guns, I think then that might finally get through. I don't know. But on a smaller local level, when I read from this book, I tell every group that I read, what you can do today is share one of these stories with somebody else.
Yeah.
That's what you can do.
Absolutely.
I can't say it more simpler than that, because hearing these stories should change things in people's minds.
Yeah. I think
if they have a heart.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big sort of prerequisite.
Yeah.
And hopefully they do. And this is the thing. Yeah. Most people do. It's just a case.
Most people do.
It is just a case of allowing, as we said, allowing yourself to kind of even just take a peek at something that you've completely shut off. Something that you completely close off. Take a look at something that is very real, very human.
Yes.
And has been very much experienced in various degrees, which you see a lot of in the book itself. I want to kind of get back onto the book for just a moment or two. One of my questions that I put here is, what have you actually learned from compiling the book? I mean, I imagine there is a lot, but what are some of the takeaways that come to mind from compiling the book?
There's a lot.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I took away from it is it was way worse than I imagined. Everything that has been happening was way worse than anyone imagines. And it's also shifted my focus to how do we get these survivors the resources and support they need? So I have deliberately shifted my advocacy from gun reform, which there are way better, more qualified, smarter people doing that and fighting that fight, to how do we get bills up in front of state houses that provide counseling, healthcare, rehabilitation services, whatever these survivors need, they need. And we need to get that. And we've gotten better with that. Yeah. Like the responses to, because unfortunately, we have to deal with it. It's not going away.
We've had to adapt to it. Yeah.
Yeah. So the responses to Parkland and Santa Fe, like they've been better, but they're still not adequate. They are not adequate. The Washington Post, they have a database on school shootings, and they estimate that 248,000 students since Columbine have experienced a school shooting in their school. 248,000 students. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
That's a lot of trauma.
That is, and that's a lot of young lives that are still in their formative stages, that are still dealing with, just the pains of being a teenager, which is hard enough as it is, or being a child. and then to have that, and then to adapt to that. And as we said before, if there isn't the appropriate aftercare, if there isn't the appropriate resources, that's something that might not be dealt with or even manifest until later in life, but may take a toll leading up to that point beneath the surface.
100%. I'll give you one of the best examples, the most obvious examples of this transitive trauma, if you will, this trauma that is vicariously felt through all of us, is Ted Hochhalter, wrote for our book, and he was in Columbine, and his daughter was shot, and she was paralyzed from the neck down. And his wife, a year after the shooting, went into a public space, a pawn shop, bought a gun, and committed suicide right there in front of everybody in that pawn shop. So now you have a group of people who witnessed this suicide, who are traumatized, which she was reacting to her trauma from the school. Like, it just never stops. It keeps radiating out. It's like a Chernobyl in every American city, right? Yeah. It just radiates out and nobody is safe.
Yeah, the ripple effect, and that's a really fantastic thing to bring to attention.
Yeah,
is the ripple effect doesn't just affect those within the immediate sort of circumference of the event.
No, think about our first responders.
Yeah, I just spoke to an EMT who has been suffering with PTSD for a long time because of the things that he's seen and the things that became routine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We also had, that's why we invited doctors to write for our book. Doctors who, had to, one gentleman, Sterling Herring, he wrote about treating students from Marshall High School and then going home to his newborn son every night and struggling with, do I put my kid in school? Do I weigh school shooting safety against that? Like, it's an impossible situation. And we spoke to an EMT in the West Nickel mine shooting. I don't know if you're familiar with that. That was in Pennsylvania, and it was near me, and it was in the Amish area of our state. And a gentleman went into a one-room schoolhouse and murdered a bunch of young girls, but he held them hostage first. It was really bad.
Yeah.
And we had an EMT that we spoke to. He ended up not being able to write for the book because he just broke down. Like, he broke down in tears even talking to us. And this man did 2 tours in Iraq.
Yeah.
And came back, and this is what broke him. Like, how much trauma can one person take? It's unbelievable to me. And the lawmakers and community leaders, they're just turning a blind eye. It's like so weird. I mean, if we had 248,000 soldiers returning home from a terrible, terrible war, you know what I mean? We would do something for them. Our veterans are not taken care of well enough in this country. Don't get me started on that. But, at least they're a population that America seems to give a shit about. And I feel like they don't give a shit about this other population that is suffering this trauma on a daily basis.
I think that boils down to a real root problem, though, that stems around division and the idea that, there are certain people with certain mindsets that couldn't care less about other people that aren't like them, that aren't in their position.
Yeah, you're right.
And I mean, that is an entirely episode worth of content on its own, which I'm not going to get into.
Look for our upcoming episode, People Who Don't Care.
Yeah. It's a 10-part series. Yeah. So I was on about things that you've learned from the book and things that have stuck out from you. Is there anything else that jumps to mind?
Yeah. While I learned that it was way worse than I thought, I also was just in awe of these people and how strong they are. And I mean, I did not know this, but after Sandy Hook happened, a bus load of Columbine survivors went to Sandy Hook.
Wow.
To support them. And then after Parkland happened, they all came down to Parkland. Huh. And there's like this almost secret network of survivors that go around and support each other. And I think Fred Gutenberg calls it the club no one wants to belong to, right?
Right. Yeah.
But it's heartwarming to see that, to see somebody who's dealing with their own grief being able to extend their heart to somebody else in that time.
Absolutely.
So I was really in awe of these people.
That is an amazing thing to come from all of this. And I think that's a good way to kind of sort of tie things off a little bit, is that, the book does go into detail, specific, very little human resonating, haunting details about these things that have happened, and the sort of spider web of trauma that has been spread out from these events. But it also seems very much like there are people finding real strength and compassion and healing and growth, which comes from that, from other people, from this shared experience, this awful shared experience that they've had, that only they and other people that have been in, as you say, at the club no one wants to belong to, that they've experienced, and finding a great sense of solace from all of this. And I think that's a wonderful thing.
And the thing I always kind of end on is, I asked myself what happened to those kids from Columbine. Well, you know what? They were all right.
Yeah.
And they're fighting for our kids.
Yeah.
They're fighting for their kids now and our kids to be safe and to be better. And they're all right. No thanks to their country.
Right.
But they're all right. They made it through, and that's a testament to them and their strength.
Absolutely. And it's a thing to hold on to as well, that it's always going to have an adverse lifetime effect on anyone that goes through this. But, with support and strength and compassion and discussion, people can make it through these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Alright, gang, so there you go. That was my chat with the wonderful Amye Archer. It was an absolute pleasure to sit down and just talk with her in general. Just a great conversation and a great conversationalist. But to really kind of get into this project in particular, I'm really grateful that she had the time to spare to talk to me about this. And I'm really grateful for the fact she's made this, because I feel like this is something that we need. It's an absolute tragedy that there is so much material that can make a book in the first place regarding this subject. It's a tragedy that there are so many real-life encounters that can make this thing a reality. But considering it is in the history books, as it were, I think that a book like If I Don't Make It, I Love You is needed, is necessary, because there is a real ongoing problem. There is a real epidemic in terms of gun culture and gun violence in this country. And as much as some people may want to stick their heads in the sand and pretend that there isn't, there is, and the statistics do not lie, and neither do these stories. These are real human stories of experience, of trauma, of grief, of just a forever changed reality. And it's just amazing that it's out there, and that it can hopefully kickstart conversations where conversations aren't being had, and it can open eyes that have been purposely closed for the longest time. Yeah, I am about halfway through the book now. At the time of doing the interview, I think I said I had done the first 2 chapters. I'm at about the halfway point. I'm having to work my way through it in chunks, because it is heavy. It is dense. It hits really hard at points. But as we said towards the back end of our chat, there is also a sense of real strength and connectivity. And there's a weird, uplifting attitude in there as well, a sense of real determination and perseverance. And, personally speaking, the level of influence and inspiration that has is just immeasurable. If you're interested in reading the book, if you're interested in getting a copy, which I highly, highly recommend you do, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put links to it in the show notes for this episode. If you go to our website, dined-out.com, or you look in the show notes on the device that you're listening to this on, you'll be able to see links to where you can purchase the book online. You'll also see a link to Amy's website and a link to her podcast, because she is also in the podcast arena. She does a podcast with her sister about 90s movies, and Little House on the Prairie. So if you're a fan of either, or perhaps even both of those things, and that has piqued your interest, yeah, definitely go check that out as well. As I said, links to all of that can be found in the show notes for this episode. And whilst you're in there, whilst you're having a rummage around in the show notes, you'll also be able to see some links that relate to Dined Out. In particular, our Patreon account. So if you've recently found the show, and for whatever reason, and I cannot even begin to fathom what that reason may be, but if for whatever reason you just need more Dined Out content in your life, then don't worry, I got you covered. If you check out our Patreon account, we've got one single tier, and you can take a look at that and the bonus goodies that are available. Mainly bonus episodes, the odd live stream, access to our Discord channel, and a few other things as well. So yeah, if you are interested, you want to get some extra content, you want to support the show, that is a very viable option. One of the best ways you can support the show without spending anything other than just a few moments of your time is to simply subscribe. If you haven't done so already, then you can just find us, presumably wherever you found this episode, and just gently boop that subscription button. Not only does it help us out with the mystical, mythical internet magic stuff, but it also gives you every episode from the show moving forward, and you don't even have to do a thing, which is nice. Speaking of nice, something else that helps us tremendously is ratings and reviews. Ratings more so, because I know that takes less time, but if you are inclined to leave a nice review, then what we're doing this season is we are encouraging haiku reviews. Nice reviews only, in the traditional haiku format. 3 lines, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, 7 syllables. If you want to do that. Again, completely optional. But it would be nice. And last, but certainly most definitely not least, if you want to leave some feedback in a more direct fashion, then you can do so. You can get in touch with me on Twitter or Instagram, or you can find me at I am Mal Foster. You can leave me your feedback on particular episodes, topics that we've covered. You can even leave suggestions for things you would like to hear the show cover moving forward into the future. Or you can just stop by and say hi. Or as I've said before, and I'm not above doing it again, I will solicit for cute pet pictures. If you've got an adorable pet and you want to show it off, then by all means, send them over. Showboat that fur baby of yours. Or if it's got, I don't want to say scales. I'm not into lizards. I'm just saying that now. You might love your big iguana. You might just absolutely adore your big Komodo dragon. You might snuggle with it, and it may bring you a good sense of comfort and well-being. And if that's the case, great, all power to you. Good for you guys. But I'm not a fan of reptiles. So, yeah. If you want to send me a reptile pic, actually I shouldn't tell people that, because now I'm just going to probably get just like an absolute just pile of reptile pictures. And on that note, on that totally unrelated to anything kind of note, that's pretty much it for this week. Next week's episode is gonna be a bit of a surprise. You just got to tune in next week to find out what we're talking about. Yeah, I'm doing that to you. How about that? I mean, I'm sure you'll manage to get through your week just fine. But yeah, you just have to tune in next week to see what we're going to be talking about. But as for this week, we are pretty much done. In fact, no, we are actually done. As always, thank you for listening. Look after yourselves, look after each other, and until next time, don't you dare send me any bloody reptile pictures. I mean it. I just don't like them.